Hey guys, oftentimes in the comment section, from those who are really struggling to understand grace, I hear this accusation that I only teach the doctrine of Paul and that I don't teach the doctrine of Jesus, as if somehow the chief apostle to the Gentiles, who was responsible for 2/3 of the New Testament, had a different gospel than Jesus Christ. And people tend to do this. They try to create this rift between the doctrine of Jesus and the doctrine of Paul because they can't seem to wrap their head around the grace that Paul preaches. And they think, in the foolishness of their mind, that somehow Jesus is preaching a different message. They're trying to cling to Jesus, thinking that Jesus is supporting their law-based gospel message and that Paul is somehow a false apostle and that Paul is teaching a different gospel than Jesus Christ because they don't have understanding of the scriptures. Okay, Peter talks about this. So what I want to do today is I want to give you 3 different accounts of Jesus. Let me repeat. 3 different accounts of Jesus Christ, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, Emmanuel, God with us, God himself in the flesh, Jesus Christ, where he is speaking to a sinner and he is fully and finally acquitting them of all sin and declaring a not guilty verdict over them. Okay, I'm going to give you 3 separate accounts where Jesus essentially is proclaiming the gospel over 3 different sinners. Now, when we go over these 3 accounts, I want you to think about 2 things. Number 1, I want to repeat that this is Jesus Christ, God himself, the great I am, rendering a not guilty verdict over all 3 of these people. Do not come in my comment section trying to argue with Jesus, okay? Jesus Christ is the King of Kings. You are not. He is the one who sits on the throne of the universe. His verdict is final, okay? Please do not come into my comment section trying to argue with the verdict of the King of Kings. I know some of you will because you're that offended by the gospel, but please do not do that, okay? Not a good idea, all right? Secondly, I want you to think about in all 3 of these situations what it was that caused Jesus to render that not guilty verdict. What was it about each of these 3 individuals that caused Jesus to say, forgiven, not guilty? Okay? I want you to think about it in your head. What was it that was the requirement for Jesus to render a not guilty verdict over them? Okay? Because at the end of this, we're going to come to the definition of what faith actually means. Because I know people love to try and complicate faith. They try to complicate the word believe. They try to make it something other than what it is. But by the end of this, we're going to see what the biblical definition of faith and belief is. Okay? We're going to start in Luke chapter 7 with the sinful woman. Starting in verse 36. Then one of the Pharisees asked Jesus to eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and sat down to eat. And behold, a woman in the city who was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at the table in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster flask of fragrant oil. And she stood at Jesus' feet behind him, weeping. And she began to wash his feet with her tears and wipe them with her hair on her head. And she kissed his feet and anointed them with the fragrant oil. Now when the Pharisees who had invited him saw this, he spoke to himself, saying, this man, if he were a prophet, would know who and what manner of woman this is who is touching him, for she is a sinner. Now, the language here in the Greek for sinner is a reference to like some kind of grave sin, all right? This woman, whoever she was, whatever her sin was, the passage doesn't say, but it implies that she was well known in the community as someone with serious sin. Some people imply that this was sexual sin, like prostitution. We don't know because the text doesn't really say, but it does imply that she's a well-known sinner of some kind of serious sin in the community. And that's important for you to recognize in the passage. Verse 40. And Jesus answered and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. So Simon said, Teacher, say it. Verse 41, Jesus replies, there was a certain creditor who had 2 debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. And when they had nothing with which to repay, he freely forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him more? See what Jesus just did there? He said there was 2 debtors. 2 people that owed a debt to somebody. One had a big debt, a large debt. The other had a small debt. And he says, which one do you think will love the man who forgave them more. Firstly, I want you to notice that he says that he freely forgave them both. Freely implies nothing was required of them. Okay? Secondly, the point Jesus is making is this man, Simon, this Pharisee, thought that this woman was a much greater sinner than he was. Okay? That was the foolishness in his mind. He expected that this woman was too grave of a sinner to receive forgiveness. And Jesus is saying, and he's about to make this point, that as great of sin as this woman has on her account, she has loved me, and you have not. Okay? Which one do you think will love the one who forgave them more? The one with great debt or the one with little debt? Okay? That's the point he's trying to make. Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more would be the one that would love him more. And he said to him, you have rightly judged. Then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hair on her head. You gave me no kiss, but this woman has not ceased to kiss my feet since the time I came in. You did not anoint my head with oil, but this woman has anointed my feet with fragrant oil. Therefore I say to you, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she has loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, the same loves little. Then he said to her, your sins are forgiven. And those who sat at the table with him began to say to themselves, who is this who even forgives sins? Then he said to the woman, pay attention, woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. The one who has been forgiven of much loves much. You see what he's trying to do here? Firstly, I want you to think, what did Jesus say was the reason that he forgave this woman? Did this woman promise Jesus to make him Lord of her life? Did she promise Jesus that she was going to keep the law from this day forward? That she was going to be perfect? That she was never going to sin again? Was any of that the reason why Jesus freely forgave her? No. He said, woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Notice he said saved, past tense. Now, I want you to remember, I know there are some of you going to come into the comment section and say, well, he said that she'd be saved past tense, but that doesn't mean that she can't mess up in the future and then he'll retract it. Folks, Jesus is not a normal man. Jesus is God himself, the great I am, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. If Jesus, who all judgment has been given to, has rendered this woman saved, sealed, forgiven, I can promise you with 500% certainty, you will see her at Jesus' side on the day of judgment. I can promise you that. You know why? Because the King of Kings said so, and he's the judge, and what he says goes. There's no arguing with Jesus. And he says this woman, her faith saved her. Now, what did this woman practically do? She recognized that she was a great sinner, and she believed that Jesus could forgive her. That's what Jesus said she did. She loved him so much. She was washing his feet with her hair and her tears. She gave him the fragrant oil. She was kissing her feet. This was her loving Jesus. She loved him so much. Why? Because her many sins were forgiven her. She knew and believed that Jesus could forgive her of all of her sins. And she loved him for it. Her faith is what saved her. She believed that Jesus Christ was who he said that he was, and that he had the power to forgive her of all of her sins, and she loved him for it. It was her faith. Her faith that he was who he said that he was, and that he would do what he said he would do. Your faith has saved you. Let's go on to the next passage. Here we are at Jesus' crucifixion in Luke chapter 23, starting in verse 39. I'm sorry, I'm in the dark here, so I'm trying to read this to you from my car in the dark. And my eyes are old. I'm getting old, guys. So Jesus is being crucified, and there are two criminals, one to his left, one to his right. Then one of the criminals who were hanging blasphemed Jesus, saying, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other, answering, rebuked him, saying, "Do you not even fear God, seeing you are under the same condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we receive the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And Jesus said to him, "Assuredly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." So let's walk through this. You've got two men who are being crucified as criminals, okay? They were being crucified for a lifetime of sin, okay? And one of them who blasphemes Jesus, and the other one who simply recognizes that he's receiving the due penalty for his deeds and recognizes that Jesus is who that he says that he is when he says, "Lord, when you get to your kingdom, please remember me." That's all he did. And boom, kick it up a notch. Just like that, in a nanosecond, Jesus proclaimed that man not guilty. Now, did that man get down off that cross and help little old ladies across the street and give to charity and get himself baptized and promise to keep the law of Moses and do all kinds of good works? It was one moment of faith. When that man recognized that he was receiving the due reward of his deeds, that he was a sinner, rightly condemned, and recognized that Jesus was who he said that he is, and said, "Jesus, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. Remember me when you get to your kingdom." Boom! Just like that, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords said, "Not guilty." Tell me again that salvation is by works. Tell me again that salvation is something we merit or we earn. Folks, it's by faith. What is faith? Simply believing the message of Jesus Christ. And now to the longest one of them all. Here we are in John chapter 8, starting in verse 1. And everyone went to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Now early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and the Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in his midst, they said to him, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now Moses, in the law, commanded us that such a woman should be stoned. But what do you say?" This they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down and wrote on the ground with his finger, as though he did not hear. So when they continued asking him, he raised himself up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw the first stone." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Then those who heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest, even to the last. So do you see what the hypocrite does? Do you see what those... Now remember, these were not harlots, these were not homosexuals, these were not adulterers. These were Pharisees, religious, zealous men. But do you see what the hypocrite does? They hold you under the full standard of the law, but they give themselves a pass. They condemn you to hell, but they condemn themselves, although they do secretly the very same things. Romans chapter 2. This is the fruit of the Pharisee, hypocrisy, right? Okay. Then those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning with the oldest even to the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in his midst. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? She said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said to her, Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Then Jesus spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but have the light of life. Sorry, guys. So here's this woman who's guilty under the law of Moses. And the Pharisees are right when they say that the law of Moses condemns this woman to death, right? She was guilty. Nobody's pretending that she wasn't. She had been caught in the act of adultery. And by the law of Moses, the law says to stone her to death. And here the King of Kings, who is the author of the law of Moses, because he is God, he freely pardoned her. Guys, everybody gets stuck on the go and sin no more, but they forget the order. Jesus freely pardoned her. She didn't have to do anything. She didn't commit to him to make him Lord of her life. She didn't commit to him to never sin again. She didn't run and get baptized. She simply had a mustard seed of hope for his mercy. And he freely pardoned her. And then he said, go and stop doing this. Of course he would say that. Jesus is not a minister of sin, okay? Jesus is not, he's not an endorser of sin. He's not telling his disciples, go out and live in sin. Of course not. He's God. Of course his message to this forgiven woman is, now go, child, and stop doing this thing that got you here to begin with. What good father would encourage his child to continue in something that was poison? This is not controversial. Jesus was not telling this woman that what was required of her was a future life of sinlessness. He was simply saying, I have forgiven you freely. Now go, child, and stop doing this. This is no longer who you are. Receive my grace. Walk as a daughter of God, right? It's no different than as a paramedic. I've said this before, I think, in my videos. How many times I have patients who overdose on opiates, and we give them a we get there, they're not breathing, they're circling the drain, they're bordering death, and I give them a medication called naloxone, Narcan, and it immediately reverses their symptoms, and they come back almost like they rose from the dead, okay? And what do you think I say to them? You need to stop doing this. You really need to stop doing this. And is that the same thing as me saying, hey, listen, the next time you do this, if you call 911, I'm not coming, and I'm not going to give you this medication. I'm going to let you die. Is that the same thing as me saying that, folks? No. Now, interestingly, there are some counties in America, I think it's over on the West Coast, where they have a 3-strike rule, meaning if you've been resurrected by naloxone by EMS 3 times, they don't revive you any longer, which I would not work for that system, because that is evil. That is wicked. And I would never work for that system. But again, do you see the difference between man's mercy, man's grace, and God's infinite mercy and infinite grace? Okay, of course I say to my patient, man, listen, you've got to stop this, right? Like, this is no good. You've got to stop doing this. Does that change the fact that if they fall or stumble again, that I'm going to be right there again to bring them back if I can? No, of course not. Never. Whether they call me 100 times or 200 times, I'm always going to be there and bring them back. And I'm going to say to them again and again, you've got to stop doing this. You're killing yourself. This is wrong. You've got to stop doing this. But what a legalist does is they read this passage and they turn it into a law. But they forget the order. Jesus freely forgave her. And then he said, go and stop doing this. Of course, he says that to his children. Let all who name the name of Christ depart from iniquity. We all, as the body of Christ, have a new identity. And yet we all still stumble. That's a fact. We don't stop being justified. We don't stop being forgiven when we stumble and when we fall. That's not grace. If grace is only for perfect people, it ain't grace at all. We all still stumble in many ways, as James says. Folks, notice here that Jesus is preaching the same gospel as Paul. This woman was guilty under the law of Moses. She was worthy of death. Did Jesus grant to her what the law provided and expected and demanded? The law demands death for this woman. Did Jesus, the mediator, give her what the law demanded? The one who essentially wrote it. He's God. He is the great I am, right? And his law demands death for the thing she was caught doing. Did he give her what the law demanded? No, he did not. Was that because God changes? No, God does not change. The law hasn't changed. God hasn't changed. God does not change. What changed was that Jesus took the penalty of her sin upon his own body when he went to the cross. And notice he hadn't gone to the cross yet, and yet he still covered her sin under his atonement, because nobody was ever saved by the law. They looked forward, we look back. All sin, past, present, future, under the cross of Christ. Folks, none of these three people deserved forgiveness. None of them did one single solitary thing to be declared by the King of Kings as saved. And if any of you think that there's even a shred of a chance that either one of those three people will not be in heaven, I don't know what to tell you, because you're arguing with the King of Kings. You're arguing with God himself, who declared a not guilty verdict over all three of them. And he did so on all three accounts by grace through faith. So there's no separation in the doctrine of Paul and Jesus. They are one and the same. We are saved not of ourselves. It is the gift of God, not by works, lest any man should boast. No flesh will be justified by the works of the law. And anyone seeking to be justified that way is under a curse to keep the whole thing. And as James says, to break the law in just one way is to break all of it. It demands perfection. You don't want to go that path. You want to be justified the way the woman with the alabaster jar was, the way the man on the cross was, the thief on the cross that was, the woman that was told, go and sin no more. You want to be saved and justified that way. You don't want to be saved and justified by your works or by the law, because you're never going to be good enough. Folks, as good as you may think that you are, your works will never be good enough. You don't want to be trusting that on the day of judgment. You want to be rendered not guilty based on God's grace and God's mercy and nothing else. Please, please put your trust in God's grace and his mercy and the blood of Jesus. I love you.